This week on Givers, Doers, and Thinkers, we talk to one of America's foremost thinkers on philanthropy, Indiana University's Les Lenkowsky, about the Jewish philanthropic tradition in America. We highlight in particular Julius Rosenwald, who funded over 5,000 schools for African Americans in the Deep South in the first half of the 20th century. Les also discusses the impact of the Trump administration on contemporary philanthropy, and we touch on the troubling rise of anti-Semitism. Let's go. Welcome to Givers, Doers, and Thinkers, a podcast on philanthropy and civil society. My name is Jeremy Beer. I'm your host. Honored to have you with us, and very honored to have with me today as our guest, Dr. Les Lenkowsky. How are you doing, Les?
Hello. I'm fine, thank you.
We are going to be talking about the Jewish philanthropic tradition in America, and specifically an especially interesting representative of that tradition in Julius Rosenwald. Before we get going, let me tell people a bit about who you are, although this is your second time on this podcast, and I appreciate you coming on. Les is professor of practice in the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, my alma mater. We used to call it SPIA. Do they still call it SPIA?
I think we somehow combined them, so it's very long.
Yeah, it is. It's too long a name, but it works. And a member of the Philanthropic Studies faculty of the IU Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, which of course is the leading such academic department or school in the country. Les is a political scientist by training, PhD from Harvard, also served as the president of nonprofits in the past, including the Hudson Institute, and in government as the CEO of the Corporation for National and Community Service under President George W. Bush from 2001 to 2004. So pretty much correct and accurate?
That's got it.
Okay.
Plenty.
All right. I know there's more, but try to keep these things reasonably simple. We're very happy to have you with us, Les. And we're going to talk about Julius Rosenwald, what he did, why he was important. But let's go back to the founding era first, because the theme of this season of the podcast is the American semi-quincentennial. I think I'm saying that correctly. The America's 250th birthday or anniversary. So because that's a theme here, let's just go back first before we get to Julius Rosenwald. What was the position or a place of American Jews within American society around 1776? And what kind of interaction did Jewish communities have with key figures in the founding generation?
There were not a lot of Jews here, but I think the general atmosphere of toleration in many, though not all, of the colonies proved to be a welcoming one for Jews. A Jewish financier named Chaim Solomon helped finance the Revolutionary War armies. Shortly after he became president, George Washington wrote a famous letter to the Truro Synagogue in Rhode Island, welcoming Jews and pledging that this would be a country in which they'd be able to pray and sit under their own, I believe it was a fig tree, peacefully. So there was a general recognition of tolerance. On the other hand, it was also true that there were elements of discrimination in practice against Jews, say admission to higher education, for one. There were quotas, limits to that, perhaps certain businesses, but they were certainly less than those that Jews had encountered in the old world.
Fewer pogroms per year in the United States.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, a very different attitude here. One of my favorite stories is when Ulysses S. Grant was president in the latter part of the 19th century. There was a pogrom, I believe it is in what is now Romania or Moldova, and Grant not only denounced it, but he nominated as his ambassador to that country a Jewish American. This was the spirit, not consistently, of course, but there was certainly a lot of that.
What were the great periods of Jewish immigration into the U.S., like sort of prior to the 20th century? What are the...
There was a major Jewish immigration in the middle part of the 1800s, mostly coming from Germany. There were quite a bit of political ferment in Germany at the time.
Right.
A lot of Jews left the country.
And all that.
Yeah, exactly. And then again, at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century, we saw a major influx of Jews in the United States, this time from Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland, and so on. That was probably a much larger group.
Do we see, just like we would see, say, with Catholic philanthropy, as you get these huge influxes of Irish and Italian immigrants and others, do we see a sort of concomitant step up of Jewish philanthropists that kind of goes along with waves of Jewish immigration?
Yes, indeed. And of course, a lot of it was communal. There was a study done of what are called Landsmannschaften, which we would regard as mutual societies today, in New York City in the early 20th century, and found hundreds of them, often among new Jewish immigrants, often organized by the parts of Europe from which they came. And these were societies that enabled these new immigrants to learn how to become Americans. They would typically begin with the Pledge of Allegiance and so on. They also provided some useful functions, such as maintaining cemeteries. My family, actually, there is a family plot in a cemetery on Long Island that dates back to this period. And regularly, I send a small amount of money to a person I've never met, but is a distant relative, whose job it is to collect the money and send it to the people who maintain the cemetery.
Yeah, we forget that burial was one of the big needs that mutual aid societies rose to meet, wasn't it? Fraternal societies.
Indeed. And of course, there were lots of synagogues in all parts of the country. We typically think of the Jewish immigration into the Northeast, but in fact, it spread widely. Julius Rosenwald, whom we'll be discussing later, his family made it to Illinois. Others went into the South. A lot of them were merchants, and some of the famous early marketing names were Jewish families that had immigrated and moved elsewhere. And where they went, they founded communal institutions. In addition to cemeteries, of course, there would be synagogues, hospitals, or other kinds of health clinics. Not so much schools, as we saw among Catholics, for example. There was a Jewish day school movement. It was pretty small until fairly recently.
The communal institutions that were founded and funded, these communal institutions, were they mainly to serve the Jewish community, or do they have more of an external focus?
They were mainly to serve the Jewish community, though as Jews became more prosperous in their community, they would join other groups that were broader, the Rotary, Kiwanis, and so on. Obviously, public schools provided a very important nexus for communication with the wider community. Also, again, one shouldn't minimize the amount of discrimination that went on. I still remember I went to high school in the 1950s, and I was invited to join a club, or the possibility of joining a club arose. And it was explained to me by my parents that this was a club for Christians, not for Jews.
Yeah, interesting.
But Jews had their own clubs and their own institutions.
The experience of discrimination, that's a good segue into talking about Julius Rosenwald. So Rosenwald's born in 1862.
Yeah.
Is he born in Chicago?
I believe it was Springfield, Illinois. In fact, the house in which he grew up is now part of the Abraham Lincoln Homestead. It's one of the buildings on that homestead in Springfield, Illinois.
How does he rise to become an executive at Sears Roebuck?
Yeah.
For those who don't know,
it's a fascinating story that really touches on what we were just talking about. Mr. Rosenwald's parents were tailors, and they ran a clothing store in Springfield, Illinois. And Julius was headed into the business. In Yiddish, we call it the schmata business. And he was headed into it. And as part of his education, he took a trip to New York to learn about the business as well as finance and so on. And he wound up living in a boarding house. He's a young man now, probably late teens, early 20s, lives in a boarding house where among the other residents, there were people named Morgenthau and Goldman, as in Goldman Sachs. That was the Goldman. So in this little network, I'm sure this would have been a boarding house for young Jewish men. They got to know each other well. He goes back into the business, eventually is the chief executive, moves up to Chicago, a business there, and got a reputation in Chicago. Sears, what we knew as Sears Roebuck, started in the late 19th century and was modestly successful, but did have its problems. And Rosenwald moved over to Sears Roebuck, as I believe the marketing executive for it. Sears, in many ways, was the Amazon of its day, if you think of it that way. One of its principal marketing efforts was a catalog that would go to houses, families all over the United States, and particularly in the Midwest. You could buy anything you needed from this catalog, including a prefabricated home that you could then put up. Eventually, opportunities arose largely because of some business problems the company had. And I think this is the first decade of the 20th century, maybe the last of the 19th. And Mr. Rosenwald used his connections with a young Goldman to develop an initial private offering. This was the first one that the company we now know as Goldman Sachs ever did.
Wow.
And he used it to buy a controlling share in the company and became its chief executive, and used his marketing skills, as well as he was very good at what today we would call HR personnel. He had a real feel for how do you motivate employees, get the best performance out of them, and so on. And he used all those skills to build Sears Roebuck into a colossus, as well as create a substantial fortune for himself.
Had to be one of the biggest companies in America at this time we're talking about?
I think it probably was at that time.
I don't know.
A lot depends how you count the Rockefeller oil trusts. And maybe the Ford Motor Company. But there's no question at all that Rosenwald was among the giants of commerce in that time. There are any number of pictures of banquets and so on, which you'll see people like Rockefeller and Ford and Rosenwald.
Carnegie and those guys. Did he have the personal wealth of the robber baron types? Was it that big, or were we a tier or two down?
It probably was a tier or two down, partly because he would continue to give it away. One of the key characteristics of Mr. Rosenwald's philanthropy, whose roots lie in the Jewish religious obligation to repair the world, as it's called, he would constantly be engaged in philanthropic projects. So while he made a lot of money, he also gave a lot of it away. In the 1920s, in fact, he wrote two famous essays, I believe, for Harper's Magazine, making the case for what we call today giving while living and limiting the lifetime of your foundations. Now, this was not a new idea. In fact, Andrew Carnegie in The Gospel of Wealth also said that wealthy people should give away their money in their lifetimes. Carnegie wrote, "The man who dies with his wealth intact dies in disgrace." But Carnegie himself never managed to do it, whether because he didn't try hard enough or because his wealth just kept growing. And so came a point around 1910 where he transferred everything into a foundation, which we know today as the Carnegie Corporation. Rosenwald really had the same idea and articulated it very well. It was not only an obligation to give in one's lifetime, but he also felt that foundations that were set up as permanent endowments were likely to become too bureaucratic. This was not a political argument. It's interesting. As far as we know, Rosenwald was a Republican businessman of his era. very much a centrist, a Midwestern Republican, but that didn't really enter into his philanthropy. Yeah. He felt that if a foundation is set up to live forever, the people running it, especially after the initial donor, would be spending too much time worrying about preserving the endowment, avoiding taking risks, and so on. So basically, his argument was for good philanthropy. You need to have a limited lifetime, give while living. And that's what he did. Initially, a lot of his giving went to Jewish communal causes, particularly in Chicago, cultural centers, and so forth.
But then he starts giving to Black YMCAs. Is this sort of his first foray?
Yeah, this is always a little bit murky, but I think he attended a synagogue in Chicago whose rabbi knew Booker T. Washington.
Okay.
And so connected the two. Rabbi was a very famous rabbi in the United States at the time, connected the two. And Rosenwald started supporting Washington's school, Tuskegee Institute in the South, and others like it. The Washington's thrust was really for what today we would call vocational and technical training, for people who, after all, were the children of free slaves. At some point, though, Rosenwald asked Washington what else could he do. Remember, Rosenwald's an entrepreneur, and like most entrepreneurs, he's looking for the next thing. Yeah. And Washington basically tells him, I'm summarizing, there's an excellent book by a woman who is married to a Rosenwald descendant on the schools, Stephanie Deutsch, called You Need a Schoolhouse. And I was not going to show very well.
Yeah, but I was going to ask you this question anyway, though, so I'm glad we're calling it out. So You Need a Schoolhouse? That's a good book on this?
Right. Okay. You Need a Schoolhouse by Stephanie Deutsch. And what Washington told Rosenwald was, we're in the South, in the states below the Mason-Dixon line, schools were still segregated, which meant for African Americans and for especially rural ones, the quality wasn't very good. So in 1910, Rosenwald began a program that resulted in the building of 5,000 schools for African Americans in the Deep South. You might think of them as early versions of charter schools. They were public schools. In fact, Rosenwald also gave money to the various state education departments in the South to provide for the oversight of these schools. But they were built actually and run by the communities themselves. They were community schools. And
they had to help come up with the money for these schools too, right?
Yes, they did. And they had to come up with the money, but also a lot of sweat equity.
Right.
There were buildings to bring in teachers. We're talking about the poorest region in the country and the poorest parts of that region needed housing for schools. Many of them were elementary schools. Some were also junior high schools or senior high schools combined. Okay. The school, for example, from which the young people left to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in the 1950s, was a Rosenwald junior high school.
Yeah. I would assume that by definition, most of these schools are fairly small because of,
yes,
that's why there has to be 5,000 of them because of transportation difficulties and everything.
They're basic one-room schoolhouses.
Yeah.
And so you had multiple grades in the room and so on, but it was a great improvement over what otherwise would have been available. In fact, we estimate, I believe it was something like a third of the children being educated at the elementary school in the Deep South over the period 1910 through the 1930s were educated in Rosenwald schools.
Wow.
An enormous number.
Was Rosenwald, besides the schools themselves and maybe some, I don't know if any money did go from the state boards of education, I guess for oversight and maintenance and so forth, were there other large philanthropists that got in on this?
There
from a
was.
funding
There was a
standpoint?
branch of the Rockefeller Foundation, the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Foundation, that was involved, and several others. This was a big interest of a number of philanthropies in the first third of the 20th century. In fact, what happened was by the middle of the 20th century, they did what foundations do by the end of the first or during the Depression, and commissioned a big study of what we've accomplished, what should we do next. That study eventually turned out to be an important work in the development of the civil rights movement, a book called An American Dilemma by Gunnar Myrdal.
Oh, that's what informed that book?
That is exactly what did. The foundations wanted to take stock of where they were. It was led by the Carnegie Foundation at this point. To finish the Rosenwald school story, by the way. So he does this over a 20-year period, and unfortunately, he passes away in 1932. The foundation is set to live for a generation after his death. It was called the Rosenwald Fund. And so there was a staff. It was headquartered in Memphis, Tennessee, and they continued with the schools, but they also established another program that had enormous effect. It was the Rosenwald Fellowship Program. And what it did was identify African American professionals of great talent and essentially give them fellowship. These were people already into their careers, but needed a boost.
Old-fashioned patronage.
It was, but it was also a talent search. There was a lot of talk at the time of finding the talented 10th. And that's what the Rosenwald Fund did. And they were very successful. Among the people they selected was the singer Marian Anderson, the diplomat Ralph Bunche, and all sorts of scientists and others who went on to great distinctions in their career. Marian Anderson, for example, used her fellowship to go to France to continue her vocal training.
Or did I read too that Langston Hughes and James Baldwin were also recipients?
It's quite possible. I couldn't even begin. There were several of them.
I think I read that. They had some sort of connection with Rosenwald support. So
the fund eventually dissolves, as was Rosenwald's intention right after the Second World War, in effect. There's still a number of Rosenwald-related foundations, the different branches of the family, but the main one, the Rosenwald Fund, does dissolve as intended.
So it's hard to imagine more impactful, I hate that word, I can't believe I just use that word, but a strategy that had more effectiveness than what Rosenwald did. We're talking about something that leads right up to the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s.
Lays the groundwork. I think everybody agrees. In fact, one of a young man who went to a Rosenwald school turned out to be John Lewis, the civil rights leader.
And Maya Angelou, too, for that matter.
Maya Angelou. You could just trace all sorts of people and with ties back to those schools.
For educating 1/3 of the African American kids in the South, there's going to be a lot of famous people who went through those schools. But my point in saying this was going to be, here you have this very effective strategy, the schools and the fellowships, and then it really lays the groundwork for the civil rights movement, all from a centrist Midwestern kind of Republican businessman type.
Exactly.
Very curious. He didn't have a socially radical point of view as far as we know.
Not as far as I know. He was basically your Midwestern business. He was always, and I think this is partly out of his religious upbringing, care for the poor and the needy was always very central. His experience as a Jew, recognizing that discrimination is something you have to work to overcome. And then just a vision, which was actually widely shared at the time, of what the United States should be like, where people have opportunities. We really believed quite strongly in equal opportunity. And this was a way that he could do something directly to further it.
In a sense, I guess you could look at the triumph of Rosenwald as the triumph of Booker T. Washington and his particular philosophy for how the African American community was going to be raised up and or raise itself up socially to something more, looking more like equality. But is that fair to say?
I think that's true. Washington, of course, has become more controversial now than he was when he lived.
Yeah.
But it certainly does testify to the importance of Washington's philosophy, though it really should be noted that in the context of his time, his philosophy was by no means unique, number one.
Yeah.
Also, Rosenwald was involved in supporting other kinds of efforts for civil rights. The NAACP, for example, is created during this period, and Rosenwald was among the supporters. He did recognize that the obstacles were not only those of lack of education and training, but laws as well. This too, this was something the Jewish community generally recognized.
Yeah. So talk about the National Park campaign. How did this come about?
I've been a member for several years of an organization whose mission is to create a national historic park in honor of Julius Rosenwald and the Rosenwald schools. The genesis of this park really came about because it turns out there are no parks, no national parks, historic sites that commemorate the work of a philanthropist, as important as philanthropy is in our country. No such park or historic site that commemorates the work of a Jewish American, and nothing that commemorates the importance of the partnership between the two groups. And it was that last point. We all know that the last years have been very difficult in terms of a variety of things we don't need to rehearse. But the idea was we need something that tells a positive story about the role of philanthropy in American life, of Jewish American and African American partnerships, and so on. So this began several years ago to create a national historic site to be administered by the National Park Service as a permanent reminder of this. That's what national historic sites do. They serve as permanent reminders. The site itself is meant to consist of a museum or visitors center in Chicago that will talk about Rosenwald's work and the schools. And then there are maybe, we don't even have an exact number, of the 5,000 schools that were created, we think about 36 at least are still existing in some shape or form. And so the historic site would provide for the National Park Service to take over perhaps up to 6 of those schools, upgrade them as necessary, maintain them, and then open them to the public with docents and so on, so you can visit them. And these schools are in various parts of the country, Maryland, South Carolina, Arkansas, and so on. So that's the idea for the historic site. So it's not one place, but you might call it a virtual historic site.
It's all part of the same National Historic Park, they would be, right?
Yes, exactly.
All these different.
And so it's meant to be a memorial, but also a teaching.
What is the level of support for this, especially in the South? Do you have the painful memory problem?
Yeah,
I think have an opportunity
so
here
far
too.
So good. So where the project stands, in the first step in the process is to have the National Park Service do what you might call a feasibility study of this idea work. And to do that, you need a bill that directs the Park Service to do it. And that bill was passed in December of 2020 with bipartisan support. On the Senate side, Senator Durbin of Illinois took the lead but the co-sponsor was Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee. There's also bipartisan support on the House side. And then it goes to the White House, since a bill does not become law unless a president signs it. And President Trump did sign it. He understood the importance of this, why it was important to do, and signed the bill. The Park Service took 2 years to do this feasibility study. It involved public hearings and all sorts of stuff, and recommended creation of the historic site, as has the Department of the Interior. So it was awaiting further action in Congress, but of course in 2024, but that was not to be done. So we are about to see the introduction of a new bill in the current Congress. We know Senator Durbin is prepared to be a co-sponsor, and we're talking to a variety of Republican senators at this point about co-sponsoring it. Similarly, on the House side, I am confident it will be bipartisan again. There are some cost implications, though a lot of the money for the buildings and so on will have to be raised privately.
Is that typical for how these things work?
That is how they work these days. The Park Service basically is a standard setting operation, provides the docents and things like that, but the actual facilities, collection of materials, and so on usually are financed privately. And our campaign, now that we're on the cusp of actually seeing a piece of legislation to create the park, or the historic park, is regearing itself to be a kind of friends of group that will raise the funds and oversee the collections.
I would think there would be pretty widespread interest in this for the reasons you mentioned. A sort of celebration of what can be accomplished with private philanthropy, certainly a celebration of something that's just good, a social good that was brought about through private philanthropy. Is that your expectation too? That there's going to be a lot
we have a number of people besides me with backgrounds in philanthropy on the governing board of the campaign. And we don't really think that fundraising is going to be a major problem. Now, we haven't really started, but all of us have lots of experience and I think have a good idea that this is a very doable fundraising task.
And it's people want to know more about this. I think is it rosenwaldpark.org, I believe.
That's our website.
Is it website?
Yep.
I'm going to double check myself here. Yep. So you can go there. There's actually lots of stuff
Lots of historical stuff. You'll see some of the schools that'll be included in the park. There's also an excellent video that we commissioned like you normally do to promote something. But it really is wonderful and emphasizes the theme of working together to improve the nation, which we so badly need today.
Yeah. And a great, as I say, we talk about America 250, a great historical, positive historical story to tell, an important one. So, I wish you luck with it. Now, while I have you, though, we're going to get off Rosenwald here for a little bit. Switch, okay? Break. I have you here, and you're a frequent and incisive commentator on philanthropy and politics. What do you think? I should say, we're recording this. It's February 21, 2025. What do you think the new administration, if we've had a whirlwind 5 weeks of the new 6 weeks of the new administration, what do you expect the impact to be on philanthropy and nonprofits?
As you say, we're only 1 month in. We live under what I call the tyranny of the 100 days, which is all presidential terms are supposed to do things in 100 days, and they rush to do them, create a lot of confusion and chaos. There is a lot of concern that I'm hearing in the nonprofit and philanthropic world about what the administration is doing. For example, its actions related to USAID actually affect lots of nonprofits, including religious charities that do a good deal of contracting for AID. So I'm hearing a lot of that. I've spoken to lots of people in the philanthropic world. The things to keep in mind, besides the fact that we're only 1 month in, number one, the direct actions the administration has taken need to be looked at. Richard Nixon's Attorney General, John Mitchell, once said, "Don't look at what we say, look at what we do." And it's sometimes hard. The rhetoric, I know, is very difficult, but it's important to look at what the administration is doing, number one. For example, there was a memorandum issued on heads of federal agencies that work with nonprofits. It consisted of 2 paragraphs. One was a lot of bluster. I would have preferred it wasn't in, but there it was. The second, though, was the operative paragraph, which basically instructed the agencies to review their rules, their guidelines, procedures to make sure they're consistent with administration policy. That's standard operating procedure. I did it in Bush 43 when I headed the Corporation for National Community Service. So we really have to look carefully at what is being done. A lot of concern about the DEI rules. Again, there's a lot of symbolism here. I don't want to underestimate the importance of symbolism. But when you look at it, most of what the administration is doing is going back to the Supreme Court decision and telling grantees and contractors to comply with it. So that's number one. Number two, Congress is yet to weigh in. We're going to start to see now what happens. Perfect example. A lot of nonprofits are concerned by an effort to reduce the amount allowed for overhead expenses by the National Institutes of Health to 15%. Right now, every institution negotiates an overhead rate, which could be as high as 60% or so. The Trump administration has proposed a flat 15% rate, pointing out, not incorrectly, that this is still higher than private donors often allow. This is not a new idea. The first Trump administration tried exactly the same idea. What happened? It was rebuffed by Congress. The appropriations bills made it quite clear, can't do this. And it was repeated many years. We'll have to see what happens. And I'm not drawing any conclusion about merits here. I'm just saying that the process has just begun. Already, I know Senator Britt of Alabama raised questions about this cut. So this is an issue, and of course, it'll affect University of Alabama and other institutions in her state. This is a big issue. It could account for a lot of savings, but that the Trump administration has taken a step doesn't mean it will be the final word. We'll see where Congress weighs in. What I've told groups, I did a briefing for a group in philanthropy. I said, difficult as it is, now is the time to recall the famous World War II motto from Great Britain, keep calm and carry on. Nonprofit sector, should just keep calm, keep doing what it does, including advocate for points of view that it feels are not being properly considered. I think there are going to be a lot of those with regard to international development. But don't panic. We have a process here. We have to go through it. Obviously, President Trump, Elon Musk, J.D. Vance are very articulate in expressing their views, and that will undoubtedly rub people the wrong way. There are lots of people, particularly probationary employees, who are being let go from the federal government. This is a big mistake. Creating a climate of fear and anxiety is not a way in any organization to get good performance. And I think sooner or later, the Trump administration will recognize this. To some extent, already had to roll back some of these cuts. It's a moving target.
Yeah. after October 7th and everything that's happened after that, both abroad and domestically with protests and universities and so forth, I would get calls from reporters several times, well, every couple of months, like, hey, what do you think the outcome of all this will be for philanthropy? What's going to change? What is changing? And it wasn't really my area. I didn't know enough about that. But what have you seen with Jewish philanthropy, perhaps in particular, maybe philanthropy more broadly, in light of October 7th? Because it seems to me there's been a big light bulb moment in the last, whatever now, 18 months, 16 months.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's going to be an important new book coming out in July by a man named Jack Wertheimer, who is the guru on Jewish philanthropy. And I've read a long article drawn from the book. And his findings are, we've heard a lot about Jewish donors withdrawing money from universities where there have been protests. That has happened, but is not the most important event. The most important event has been a renewal of support for Jewish communal organizations. This has been a major issue. Why? There has, in our country, certainly, and other countries, been a lot of assimilation. And when, say, a Jewish woman or man marries a non-Jewish man or woman, chances are funding of Jewish institutions will decline. But October 7th has reminded everybody about their importance. And so we are seeing that. Now, how long that will last is an important issue, important question. The other side of this is there's no question at all, and well documented, an increase in anti-Semitism.
Right.
Jewish students, I just did an event here with our Jewish students, are concerned about being too identifiably Jewish.
Same.
This is all unfortunate. We need good leadership here. At Indiana University, we had an encampment last spring. The president brought the state police in immediately. I'd like to see more leadership like that from people who had institutions of higher education, but also other kinds of institutions. It would be very good. There's also, by the way, a growing amount of interest in Jewish, Christian, Hindu, interestingly, collaboration. We've worked with groups in the Christian community that want to do something about rising anti-Semitism. Same with Hindus.
Interesting.
So we may see lots developing.
Hindus I didn't know about. Catholics and Christians I did through an organization called the Philos Project.
Yes, that's exactly the one we've been working with.
Yeah, on the Christian side to highlight and expose and address this, to me, just absolutely bonkers, insane rise in anti-Semitism, not just on the fringy or highly progressive left, but also on the right. It'd be good in the end too.
It certainly is very good for Jewish students.
Come out of this, I should say.
For Jewish students to know that they are not alone.
Telling as I said, we shared the very inspiring, positive story of Julius Rosenwald and what he accomplished. Maybe is one way to do that. Thanks, Les, for what you're doing on that project and for joining us here today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Jeremy.
Appreciate you as always. Thanks, my friend. Hey, thanks for joining us for today's podcast. If you enjoyed it, we invite you to subscribe or rate or review us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to our podcasts. Thanks a lot.